Welcome to another episode of the Ginger ROAMance. Here, you'll hear anonymous stories from travellers all over the world. Real submissions from real people. Tales of connection, romance, passion, heartbreak, friendship, and love in all its forms. Because every kind of love deserves to be told. This week on the Ginger ROAMance, we share a heartbreak story set in Berlin, Germany. This is a story about betrayal, friendship, and finding unexpected strength abroad. Let's get into it. I moved to Berlin when I was 29. If you've ever relocated to a new country alone, you'll understand what I mean when I say that the hardest part isn't the paperwork, the language, or even the homesickness. It's the loneliness. The kind that creeps in around ordinary moments. The walk home after work, Sunday afternoons, buying groceries, or eating dinner by yourself. I had accepted a 2-year role with an international company, and while it was an incredible career opportunity, it felt like someone had picked up my entire life and shaken it like a snow globe. Everything familiar was gone. My friends, my routines, my support system. Even simple conversations felt harder. For the first few months, I lived in a cycle of work, gym, apartment, repeat. I knew I needed to build a community if I was going to survive those 2 years emotionally. So I started joining expat groups. Language exchanges, social meetups, coffee mornings, pub nights. Anything that got me out of my apartment. And that's where I met him. It was a Thursday evening social event at a rooftop bar overlooking the city. I noticed him because he was talking to everyone. Not in an attention-seeking way, just effortlessly. The kind of person who could make strangers feel comfortable within 30 seconds. He introduced himself and we chatted for maybe 10 minutes. Then I moved on and talked to other people. That was it. The next day, he messaged me. He had gotten my number through the group chat. He asked me out for a coffee. I politely declined. I wasn't interested. Not because there was anything wrong with him. Actually, the opposite. He seemed charming, confident, attractive, which was exactly why I wasn't interested. I'd just moved countries. I was trying to prove myself in a demanding new role. The last thing I wanted was a relationship. Especially with someone who seemed capable of turning my life upside down. But he didn't disappear. A week later, he invited me to a museum. I said no. A few days later, he suggested lunch. I said no again. Then a street food festival. Another no. At some point, it became funny. Whenever my phone buzzed, I'd wonder what creative invitation he'd come up with next. He never pressured me, never guilted me, and never acted offended. He just kept trying. Patiently. Eventually, after nearly 6 weeks, I agreed to dinner. Mostly because I admired his persistence, and partly because I was curious. The date lasted 6 hours. Then another date followed. Then another. And somehow, without ever intending to, I found myself falling for him. He was intelligent without being arrogant, funny without needing attention, kind without making a performance of it. He remembered small details, asked thoughtful questions, and made me feel seen. For someone who'd spent months feeling disconnected from everything around her, that feeling was powerful. What started as casual dating slowly became something serious. We spent weekends exploring different neighbourhoods, visiting markets, trying tiny restaurants we'd never heard of, walking for hours, building rituals, inside jokes, and shared routines. The sort of things that quietly become the framework of a relationship. By around 8 months, we were having the big conversations. Marriage, children, long-term plans. Where we'd live, whether we'd stay in Germany, what our future might look like. I wasn't someone who rushed into relationships, and neither was he, which made those conversations feel meaningful, deliberate, real. At least that's what I thought. Then something strange happened. One evening, I attended a women's social gathering through one of the expat communities. A new woman had recently joined. She'd only been in Berlin a few months. We were all introducing ourselves, sharing stories about adjusting to life abroad. At one point, she started talking about someone she was dating. I wasn't really paying attention initially, until she described him. Funny, smart, thoughtful, kind, persistent. I smiled to myself. A lot of people fit that description. Then she mentioned his name, the same name as my boyfriend. My stomach flickered, just slightly. But Berlin is a huge city, and people share names. I ignored it and I carried on with my evening. Over the following weeks, though, things started changing. His behaviour shifted, subtly at first. Longer gaps between messages, cancelled plans, less enthusiasm, less warmth. Whenever I asked if everything was okay, he'd tell me that work was stressful, or that he was tired, or he was dealing with some personal stuff. I wanted to believe him, so I did. Then one Friday, he told me he was going away for the weekend with his friends. No issue. People have lives outside of their relationship. I kissed him goodbye and I told him to have fun. The following week, I attended another women's social event. The newer woman was there again. At some point, she started talking about a weekend trip she'd just taken with her boyfriend. Something about the way she described it caught my attention. The timing matched. The location matched. A cold sensation settled into my chest. Still, I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Instead, I asked questions. Casually, like women often do. How did they meet? What was he like? What did he do for work? Every answer tightened the knot in my stomach, because every detail matched. She laughed while telling the story, completely unaware of what was happening inside my head. Then she said something that nearly made me stop breathing. He pursued me for weeks before I finally agreed to a date. Exactly like me. She described being reluctant, being busy, being cautious, and how he had eventually swept her off her feet. Exactly like me. I remember feeling detached from my own body, like I was watching the conversation happen from across the room. Then I asked if I could see a photo. I framed it as harmless curiosity, just girls being girls. She happily pulled out her phone, and there he was, smiling back at me. My boyfriend, my future, my relationship, my lie. I don't really remember much after that. The room suddenly felt too hot. My heart was pounding, the sound of people talking around me. I somehow made it home. I didn't cry, not immediately. I just sat there, staring at a wall, trying to understand how someone could construct two parallel relationships with such confidence. How many conversations had been copied and pasted? How many promises? How many plans? How many futures? That night, I packed every item he'd left in my apartment. A toothbrush, a jumper, books, chargers, small traces of a person I'd trusted. I placed everything neatly beside the front door, and then I messaged him. "Can you come over tonight? We need to talk." An hour later, he arrived, smiling and completely unaware. The moment he walked inside, he saw his things by the door, and his face changed instantly. He knew. Before I even said a word, he knew. I told him I'd met her. I told him I'd seen the photo. I told him I knew everything. At first, he tried to explain, then justify, then minimize. But the details don't matter, because there's no explanation that transforms betrayal into something acceptable. Eventually, I stopped listening to him. I just pointed to the door and I told him to leave. He stood there for a moment, maybe expecting negotiation, a second chance, or an argument. Instead, he got silence. He picked up his things and he walked out. And that was the last conversation we ever had. The moment the door closed, I blocked him everywhere. Phone, social media, everything. Gone. Over the following weeks, I occasionally saw them together around Berlin. At restaurants, events, and bars. The city suddenly felt much smaller than before. Whenever it happened, I'd simply leave. I refused to give him access to another second of my energy. But heartbreak doesn't disappear just because you make the right decision. I still missed him, or at least the version of him that I thought existed. I still grieved the future we'd discussed, the life we'd imagined, the person I believed he was. Then one evening, a month or so later, I saw her again at another women's event. I debated whether to say anything. Part of me wanted to avoid the situation entirely, but another part of me thought she deserved to know what kind of man she was in bed with. I eventually approached her, and I told her gently and privately everything. Her face fell in exactly the same way that mine had. She had no idea, not even a suspicion. The same promises, the same future plans, the same stories, the same performance, the same script. I answered every question she had, not because I owed him anything, but because I remembered what it felt like to sit where she was sitting. Confused, humiliated, heartbroken. A few weeks later, I saw her again. She told me she'd ended things immediately, just like I had. We sat together drinking coffee for hours, comparing stories and connecting timelines, realizing how carefully he'd managed both relationships. It was absurd, painful, almost unbelievable. Yet somehow, we found ourselves laughing, not because it was funny, but because sometimes that's all you can do. We stayed in touch. Coffee became lunches, lunches became dinners. Eventually, friendship. Real friendship. The kind that's built on honesty rather than convenience. Years later, she's still one of my closest friends. And sometimes I think about how strange life can be. I moved to Berlin expecting career growth, adventure, travel, maybe even love. Instead, the most meaningful relationship I built there wasn't romantic at all. It was a friendship born from the exact same heartbreak. As for him, I have no idea where he is now. Maybe he's still telling the same stories. Maybe he's still making the same promises. Maybe he's found someone new. Or several someone else's. I genuinely don't know. And for the first time in a long time, I don't care. Because the ending I needed wasn't watching him suffer. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't closure. It was recognizing that his deception said everything about him and absolutely nothing about me. And once I understood that, Berlin finally started feeling like home again. That's where the story ends, but not where my thoughts do. Oof, I can almost feel the heartbreak myself. This story questions how often we mistake consistency for character. This man was persistent, he was attentive, he said all the right things. And because those behaviours are usually associated with commitment, it's easy to assume they mean integrity too. But they're not the same thing. Someone can be incredibly consistent in pursuing you while being completely inconsistent in who they are behind closed doors. The bigger question is this: how much of modern dating is about spotting red flags, and how much is about recognizing that some people are simply very good at pretending? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll catch you in next week's episode. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following along to keep up to date with weekly stories that will inspire, entertain, and maybe even make you fall in love with the idea of love itself. Got your own romance story and want to be a part of the Ginger Romance community? Check the notes for details on how to submit your own.